In a small, lively kingdom nestled between rolling hills and sparkling rivers, life seemed to follow a well-ordered rhythm. The town bustled with energy, its narrow streets lined with market stalls, vendors shouting their wares, and children chasing each other under the bright sun. The kingdom, though not the largest or most powerful, was known for its strong sense of community and the legendary wealth of its ruler, King Aldrich. One bright afternoon, a young man named Simon arrived in this kingdom, full of ambition and excitement. He had traveled from a faraway land, where he had built his reputation as a clever and successful merchant. Simon was known for his sharp mind and quick wit, and he was eager to expand his business in this new, promising place. With a chest full of dreams and a mind buzzing with ideas, Simon entered the kingdom with high hopes. As Simon walked through the market square, he couldn't help but notice the grand architecture around him. The buildings, tall and majestic, stood like sentinels guarding the heart of the kingdom. The air smelled of fresh bread, spices, and the earthy scent of wood. The townsfolk were friendly, exchanging greetings as they went about their business. Simon, however, was more interested in the people who didn't seem to mix with the common crowd, the king's elite guards. The king's guards were a sight to behold. They stood tall and straight, their eyes sharp and focused, like statues carved from stone. Their armor gleamed in the sunlight, reflecting the brilliance of the royal family they served. Everyone knew that these men were not ordinary soldiers. They were the best of the best, the protectors of the kingdom, and they held great respect and power. The mere sight of them walking through the streets made the crowds fall silent, their presence commanding attention and admiration. Simon had heard whispers about the guards back in his homeland. People spoke of their strict discipline, their unmatched skills in battle, and their loyalty to King Aldrich. But to Simon, they were just soldiers, nothing special. To him, they were just a group of men in shiny armor, bound by duty to serve the king. And as a successful merchant, he thought of himself as someone much more important than a mere soldier. After all, it was people like him, merchants, traders, and businessmen who made the world go round, wasn't it? As Simon wandered deeper into the town square, he found himself near a group of the king's guards. They stood in their usual, imposing formation, watching over the market with their stoic expressions. They barely moved, their faces as unreadable as the stone walls of the castle. The sight of them made Simon feel a bit uneasy, but he quickly dismissed the feeling. With his growing confidence and a touch of arrogance, he approached the guards and made a remark. How boring it must be to stand around all day, wearing that heavy armor and doing nothing, Simon said, laughing to himself. You'd think they'd have better things to do than look so stiff and serious. He couldn't help it. The guards seemed like they were standing still, almost like statues. And Simon's bold nature led him to make a joke. After all, what harm could it do? They were just guards, right? He couldn't have known that his words, though light-hearted, were about to spark something he would regret. One of the guards, a tall man with a sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes, heard Simon's comment. His name was Commander Eldrick, the leader of the Royal Guard. Eldrick was a man of few words, but his reputation was known far and wide. He had been with the king for years, serving faithfully and earning the trust of the royal family. Eldrick was the kind of man who never smiled, never showed weakness, and never tolerated disrespect. His loyalty to the king and the kingdom was unwavering. When Eldrick heard Simon's remark, he didn't flinch. He knew that it was his responsibility to uphold the honor of the king's guards and protect the kingdom's reputation. To him, Simon's disrespect was not just a casual joke, it was an insult to the guards and everything they stood for. Simon, oblivious to the danger he was in, continued to stroll through the square, unaware of the silent storm brewing behind him. He couldn't resist making one more sarcastic comment as he passed the guards. I bet none of you could even move quickly in that heavy armor, Simon said with a smirk, still not realizing that his words were starting to cross a line. You look more like statues than soldiers. At that moment, Eldrick decided it was time to step in. The commander took a step forward, his boots making a sharp, echoing sound on the cobblestone ground. His figure loomed over Simon, his gaze as cold as steel. Simon, who had been so caught up in his own amusement, didn't see Eldrick approach until it was too late. He froze, looking up at the towering figure of the guard captain. For a moment, the crowd around them went quiet. The once energetic market suddenly seemed to hold its breath, sensing that something important was about to happen. "Do you find it amusing, young merchant?" Eldrick's voice was low, calm, but it carried a weight that made Simon's heart skip a beat. The sharpness in Eldrick's tone made Simon realize that perhaps he had gone too far. His smug expression faltered as he looked into the piercing eyes of the commander. I didn't mean any harm," Simon stammered, his bravado slipping away. "It was just a joke. No need to get upset." Eldrick didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took another step closer to Simon, his eyes never leaving the young merchant's face. The crowd around them held their collective breath, waiting for what would come next. Eldrick's silence spoke louder than words. "Words have power, young merchant," the commander said finally, his voice steady and unyielding. "Disrespecting the king's guard is not something we take lightly. You may find it amusing now, but such words carry consequences." Simon opened his mouth to reply, but the words caught in his throat. For the first time since arriving in the kingdom, he felt a sense of unease. The towering guard before him wasn't just a soldier, he was a protector of something far greater, something Simon had never fully understood until now. The power of the king's guards was not in their armor or weapons, but in their loyalty and their commitment to the kingdom. Eldrick continued, his gaze unwavering. "You would do well to remember that the kingdom's strength lies not only in the king but in the men who serve him." He paused for a moment before adding, "Think carefully about what you say next. Disrespect the guards again, and you will regret it." Simon, now feeling the weight of Eldrick's words, nodded slowly. He had underestimated the power of the royal guards, and for the first time, he realized just how much respect they commanded. But as Eldrick turned to walk away, Simon's confidence began to return. He convinced himself that it was all just a misunderstanding. The guards were just doing their job, and he hadn't meant anything by his comments. But little did Simon know, that moment of arrogance would soon lead him down a path he could not turn back from. The quiet of the market square began to settle back in after the brief encounter between Simon and the royal guards. The crowd, which had gathered to watch the scene unfold, slowly dispersed, muttering to themselves about the tense exchange. Some were sympathetic to Simon, thinking he was just trying to make light of the situation, while others saw it as an insult to the king's men. Simon, however, didn't fully grasp the seriousness of the moment. He stood there, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had crept into him. The captain of the royal guard, Eldrick, had warned him. But Simon's mind was still clouded by the belief that he could easily brush off the incident. After all, he was a successful merchant, someone who was used to getting what he wanted. He had been in powerful cities before, made deals with wealthy traders, and even bargained with kings. Surely, a few words wouldn't be enough to stir up any real trouble, right? But as Simon continued walking through the town, something gnawed at him. The look in Eldrick's eyes, the way the commander had spoken to him with such authority, it was different from any warning he had ever received before. For a moment, Simon paused and looked back at the group of guards standing near the castle gate, their armor gleaming in the sun. They hadn't moved an inch, their faces still as stern and unmoving as stone. But now, instead of seeing them as just soldiers, Simon couldn't help but feel a small spark of respect for them. They were more than just protectors of the king, they were symbols of power, discipline, and unity. Despite this, Simon's pride still remained. He tried to convince himself that Eldric's words had just been the result of a misunderstanding, something that could be easily forgotten. After all, the guards had no reason to pay him any more attention, right? He was just one man in a bustling kingdom. He had other, more important matters to deal with, like making connections with the local traders and establishing his business. But later that day, something unexpected happened. As the sun began to dip behind the castle, casting long shadows across the market square, Simon's thoughts were interrupted by a messenger who approached him hurriedly. The young man, dressed in simple but formal clothes, handed Simon a parchment sealed with the royal insignia. It was a summons. Simon felt a knot tighten in his stomach as he broke the seal and read the letter. The message was clear. He was to appear before King Aldric the following morning at the royal palace. It was a formal request, and the letter was signed by Commander Eldric himself. The words sent a chill down Simon's spine. Why would the king's guard need to summon him? Was this about his encounter earlier in the day? His mind raced with possibilities. Had he really offended the royal guard that much? Surely. It couldn't be that serious. But deep down, Simon knew something had shifted. The guards were not like ordinary soldiers, and the king's palace was not a place where people were summoned lightly. That night, Simon lay awake in his small room at the inn, turning the events over in his mind. He had heard stories of people being called before the king for various reasons, some noble, others not so much. What could this mean for him? Would he be punished? Or was this all just a misunderstanding? The uncertainty gnawed at him, and the more he thought about it, the more he began to feel the weight of his own actions. He had been so quick to joke, to dismiss the guards, without understanding the consequences. By morning, Simon had barely slept. His mind was in a whirlwind of confusion and doubt. He dressed quickly, trying to calm his nerves as he made his way to the royal palace. The path to the palace was lined with tall, looming trees, their branches stretching toward the sky like arms trying to grasp at something. Simon could hear the sound of his footsteps echoing in the quiet morning air as he walked through the courtyard toward the grand entrance. As he approached the palace gates, Simon couldn't help but be impressed by the sheer size and grandeur of the building. The stone walls were decorated with intricate carvings, depicting scenes of past kings and great battles. The windows were large and beautiful, letting in streams of sunlight that made the palace look even more majestic. The guards at the entrance, as expected, were the king's elite. They stood tall and proud, their eyes scanning the surroundings with vigilance. Simon felt his heart race as he was escorted into the palace, each step taking him deeper into the heart of the kingdom's power. The inside of the palace was just as magnificent as the outside. Marble floors stretched beneath his feet, and the walls were adorned with tapestries depicting the kingdom's rich history. As Simon was led through the corridors, he passed rooms filled with priceless treasures, including ornate armor, gold statues, and shimmering jewels. It was clear that the king's wealth was immense. Finally, they reached the royal throne room. The large wooden doors creaked open, revealing a room bathed in golden light. At the far end of the room stood King Aldric himself, seated on his magnificent throne, a crown resting on his head. The king's presence was commanding, and despite his age, there was a fire in his eyes that made Simon feel small and insignificant. Beside the king stood Commander Eldric, his arms crossed over his chest, his stern expression never wavering. "Approach," the king's voice boomed, sending a shiver down Simon's spine. Simon hesitated for a moment, but the guards behind him nudged him forward. With a deep breath, Simon took slow, careful steps toward the throne. His legs felt heavy, as if each step was a weight he couldn't shake off. When he finally reached the king, he knelt down, as was customary, his head bowed in respect. "Rise, young merchant," King Aldric said, his voice smooth but firm. "You have been summoned here because of an incident that took place yesterday in the market square." Simon felt a cold sweat form on his brow as the king's words sank in. He had expected to be questioned, But hearing the king himself speak of the matter made it feel all too real. "You mocked my guards," the king continued, his eyes piercing through Simon. "You disrespected not only them but the very foundation of this kingdom. The king's guards are not mere soldiers. They are the backbone of our strength, the protectors of the crown and the people." Simon opened his mouth to explain, but the king raised a hand to silence him. "I understand that your words were spoken in jest, but I also understand that the kingdom must show strength. The actions of one man can ripple through the fabric of society. And you, young merchant, have made a choice to mock the king's most loyal men." Simon's throat went dry. His mind raced, trying to figure out how to make the king understand. But before he could speak, Eldrick stepped forward, his face expressionless. "I warned you, merchant," Eldrick said coldly. "Disrespect has consequences." The silence in the throne room hung heavy in the air after Eldrick's words. Simon felt a lump in his throat. He had never expected things to escalate this far. Standing in front of King Aldrich and his imposing captain, the weight of his mistake became painfully clear. He had mocked the king's guard. A joke that had seemed harmless at first. But now, it felt like the gravest error of his life. King Aldrich, who had been quiet for a moment, looked down at Simon from his throne. His gaze was steady and calm, but it carried a sense of power and authority that made Simon feel small. There was no warmth in the king's eyes, just a quiet, measured patience. It was a reminder that the ruler of this land was not someone to be taken lightly. "Do you understand the severity of your actions?" King Aldrich asked, his voice both calm and firm. Simon hesitated, unsure of what to say. He had thought it was just a passing joke, a small jest that anyone could laugh off. But here, in the presence of the king, he realized how wrong he had been. Simon opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was struck by the realization that this wasn't just about him, it was about the kingdom, about the strength and honor of the king's guards, and the respect they commanded. He felt a deep sense of regret, but it was too late to take back what he had said. King Aldrich's eyes narrowed, as if he could see through Simon's thoughts. "This is not the first time someone has shown disrespect toward my men," the king said, his voice gaining a note of seriousness. "But I do not tolerate it lightly. The kingdom thrives on respect, respect for each other, for the law, and for the guards who protect us all." Simon swallowed hard, feeling his heart race. He had underestimated the power of words and the value of respect. He had heard stories of the king's wisdom and the loyalty of his guards. But hearing it firsthand from the king himself made it all feel so real. His earlier bravado, his belief that he could say anything and get away with it, now seemed foolish. "I did not mean to cause harm." Simon finally spoke, his voice soft and apologetic. "I am a merchant. I only wanted to bring joy, not to disrespect anyone." King Aldrich studied Simon for a moment before nodding slowly. "I believe you did not intend harm. However, your words have consequences." The king's gaze shifted slightly, and he motioned to Commander Eldrick. "It is Eldrick's decision whether to show mercy or to impose punishment. But know this, Simon. Respect is a two-way street. Just as you expect respect from others, so must you give it in return." Simon nodded quickly, his head lowered. He didn't dare meet the king's eyes, afraid that his regret would be too obvious. The weight of the king's words hung over him like a dark cloud. He was beginning to understand that in this kingdom, and especially in the presence of the king's guard, nothing was taken lightly. Eldrick stepped forward, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the room. The captain of the guard was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on Simon. Simon couldn't read his expression, there was no hint of what Eldrick was thinking. The captain's face was like stone, his sharp eyes betraying no emotion. Simon could feel the tension in the room rise as Eldrick seemed to consider his options. "You will face consequences for your actions," Eldrick said finally, his voice deep and steady. "But punishment does not always mean cruelty. The king's guard does not wish to harm you. But we must ensure that you understand the importance of respect." Simon breathed a sigh of relief. At least, Eldrick was not seeking something more severe. But still, the fear of the unknown gripped him. What kind of consequence awaited him? He had no idea, and the uncertainty made his stomach twist. "You are not to mock the king's guards again," Eldrick continued. "That is not negotiable. The respect you show will be a reflection of your place in this kingdom. The royal guard protects not just the king, but every person who calls this land home." Simon nodded quickly, realizing how naive he had been. He hadn't understood the deep connection between the guards and the people of the kingdom. They were not just warriors. They were symbols of safety, discipline, and unity. By mocking them, he had insulted something far greater than he could have imagined. "Your punishment will be this. You will work with the guards for the next month," Eldrick said. "You will spend your days assisting them, learning what it means to serve this kingdom with honor and respect. And you will learn firsthand the weight of their duty." Simon's heart skipped a beat. Work with the guards? What did that even mean? He could hardly imagine being around them, let alone working alongside them. He had thought he could continue his life in the kingdom as a merchant, making his deals and growing his wealth. But now, he was about to be thrust into a world that was completely foreign to him. "What does that entail?" Simon asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He had no choice but to accept his fate, but he wanted to understand what he was being asked to do. Eldrick's sharp eyes met his, and the captain's voice was stern. "You will follow the guards, help them with their daily tasks, and learn the discipline it takes to protect the kingdom. You will see the world through their eyes, and perhaps you will understand the burden they carry." Simon nodded, though he still didn't fully understand what he was getting into. He was a merchant, not a soldier. How could he ever understand what it was like to be one of the king's elite guards? But as he looked at Eldrick and the other guards in the room, he realized that this was his chance to prove himself. This was his opportunity to learn and grow. "Do not waste this opportunity, Simon," King Aldrich said, his voice once again carrying that calm authority. "The guards have been loyal to me, to the kingdom, and to the people. I expect you to learn the value of their service. If you show true respect and humility, this experience will be a turning point for you." Quote, over. Simon took a deep breath and, for the first time, felt a deep sense of humility. He had never imagined that he would find himself in a situation like this. He had always seen himself as someone above the common struggles of others. But now, he understood that no one was above the law of respect. "I will not disappoint you, Your Majesty," Simon said, his voice sincere. "I will learn from this, and I will show the respect you ask of me." King Aldrich gave him a small nod. "Then you may go, Simon. You will report to Eldrick at sunrise tomorrow." As Simon turned to leave, he couldn't help but feel a sense of uncertainty mixed with something else, something he had never felt before. Respect. He was about to enter a new chapter of his life, one that would challenge everything he had known. But he was determined not to let this chance slip by. He had made a mistake, yes, but he was willing to learn from it. He walked out of the throne room, feeling the weight of the king's words still pressing on him. The guards stood tall outside, their eyes watching him as he passed. He now saw them in a new light, no longer just soldiers in armor, but guardians of something much greater. As Simon made his way through the palace halls, he realized that the road ahead would not be easy. But if he wanted to earn the respect of the kingdom and its guards, he would have to change. And that change would begin tomorrow, with the dawn. The next morning, Simon awoke early, his nerves tingling with both uncertainty and anticipation. The day ahead would mark the beginning of his time working with the king's elite guards. He had never imagined he would find himself in such a position, learning discipline and duty from those he had once mocked. The thought of spending his days with the guards, working alongside them, was a far cry from the life of luxury and commerce he had imagined for himself. He quickly dressed, trying to calm the butterflies in his stomach. He had a long day ahead of him, but he had made a promise to the king: to learn, to grow, and to show respect. This was his chance to prove himself, to demonstrate that he could change. When Simon arrived at the royal barracks, the first thing that struck him was the quiet. There were no grand speeches or noisy crowds, just the sound of footsteps on the stone floor and the distant clink of armor. The barracks were simple, not nearly as grand as the palace, but they carried an air of strength and order. The guards moved with purpose, their every action deliberate, precise, and in harmony with one another. It was clear that they were used to this life, this constant routine of service and dedication. Commander Eldrick was already there, waiting for Simon by the training ground. As always, his expression was stoic, his eyes sharp, scanning the area, as if constantly on alert. He didn't speak right away, but simply nodded toward Simon, acknowledging his arrival. Simon, still feeling nervous, stepped forward and stood at attention, unsure of what to expect. "Your training begins now," Eldrick said without ceremony, his voice as steady and firm as ever. "You will observe, learn, and participate in our daily duties. No special treatment. You are here to understand the life of a guard, and that means you will do everything we do." Simon nodded, swallowing his uncertainty. He had been expecting some sort of difficult training or physical labor, but the intensity of the situation was still overwhelming. These were the king's guards, the men who were known for their loyalty, skill, and discipline. Simon knew that earning their respect would take more than just following orders. He had to prove that he was willing to change, that he could become someone worthy of the trust the guards had earned. Eldrick motioned for Simon to follow him, leading him to the training yard. The air was crisp, and the sun had just begun to rise, casting long shadows across the stone ground. Simon couldn't help but notice how the guards moved in sync, each of them performing drills and exercises with a level of precision that Simon had never seen before. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion. Everything they did seemed to have a purpose. And it was clear that each action was a reflection of years of dedication and practice. "Start by joining them," Eldrick instructed, pointing to a group of guards practicing their swordplay. "You will learn the basics of discipline, teamwork, and respect. We begin with the fundamentals." Simon was taken aback. He had never picked up a sword in his life. He was a merchant. After all, not a warrior. But he had no choice now but to follow Eldrick's orders. The idea of holding a weapon felt strange, almost absurd. But he understood the lesson Eldrick was teaching. The guards were not just trained to fight. They were trained to protect, to serve with honor. And if Simon was going to earn their respect, he had to understand that the work of the guards went far beyond just combat. He took a sword, heavy in his hands, and joined the other guards in their drills. At first, he fumbled, feeling awkward and out of place. The weight of the sword seemed to throw off his balance, and his movements were clumsy. He could feel the guards' eyes on him, some of them looking at him with curiosity, others with indifference. But Eldrick's voice rang out over the yard, instructing Simon to stay focused and keep practicing. Hours passed, and Simon's arms grew sore. Sweat soaked his clothes, and his hands began to ache from gripping the sword. But he refused to stop. He had made a promise to King Aldrich, and he was determined to keep it. He was no longer just a merchant. He was a man who had to learn the value of discipline and respect. And if that meant enduring the same challenges the guards faced every day, so be it. During their break, Simon sat down on a nearby bench, trying to catch his breath. The other guards were silent as they rested, their eyes trained on the horizon. Simon, still feeling the weight of his previous mistake, turned to one of the guards sitting next to him, a tall man with a quiet demeanor. His name was Yorin, and he had been one of the men Simon had noticed the day before. Joran had been one of the first to notice Simon's awkwardness during the drills, but he had said nothing, simply continuing his own practice with silent focus. "Why do you do this?" Simon asked, his voice softer than he intended. "Why put yourself through all this? Isn't there a better way to live?" Joran glanced at Simon, his face unreadable. For a long moment, he didn't answer, and Simon wondered if he had said something wrong. But then, Joran spoke. "We do this because we have a duty. We protect the king, but more than that, we protect the people of this kingdom. The guards are the shield that stands between the kingdom's peace and the dangers outside. Our strength isn't just in the sword, it's in our hearts. It's the willingness to give everything for something greater than ourselves." Simon absorbed Joran's words, letting them settle deep within him. He had heard of the king's guard being loyal and strong, but hearing it from one of them, up close and personal, made him realize just how little he understood before. These men were not just soldiers, they were protectors, bound together by something far more important than the glory of battle. They were united by a shared commitment to something greater than themselves. As the day wore on, Simon's training continued. His body was sore, his movements still clumsy, but he began to notice a shift within himself. Each time he lifted the sword, he thought not just of the weapon but of the responsibility that came with it. The guards didn't wield their weapons for personal gain or glory. They wielded them for the protection of the kingdom, for the safety of the people. By the end of the day, Simon was exhausted. His arms ached, his legs were tired, and his mind buzzed with everything he had learned. But as he lay down to sleep that night, something had changed inside him. He could no longer view the guards as simple soldiers in armor. They were much more than that. They were a brotherhood united not by blood, but by purpose. And though Simon still had much to learn, he knew he was beginning to understand what it meant to be truly loyal. As he closed his eyes, he thought about the work ahead of him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, and more opportunities to earn the respect of the king's guards. But Simon was ready. He had taken the first step, and he would not turn back. This experience, though difficult, would shape him into something better. A man who understood the true value of respect, hard work, and honor. As the days turned into weeks, Simon's life began to change in ways he never imagined. When he first entered the barracks, he had been nervous, unsure of his place among the king's elite guards. But with each passing day, as he learned to follow their routines, work alongside them, and understand their purpose, something deep inside him began to shift. The weight of the sword, once awkward and unfamiliar, now felt natural in his hands. His movements were becoming smoother, more confident, and most importantly, he was starting to feel a deep respect for the men he had once mocked. Every morning, he would wake before dawn and join the guards for their first drills of the day. They practiced in silence, their movements fluid and precise. The clinking of their armor, the rhythmic sound of their swords striking against the air, became a familiar backdrop to Simon's life. It wasn't just about the sword play or the physical exercises anymore, it was about the unity they shared. The unspoken bond between each guard, the way they worked together as a single, unbreakable force. Simon had learned that being part of the king's guard wasn't just about physical strength or combat skills. It was about discipline, humility, and dedication to something greater than oneself. Every task, no matter how small, was important. Whether it was cleaning the armor, sharpening the swords, or standing guard at the palace gates, each duty was carried out with unwavering commitment. Simon had started to see the world through the guards' eyes. They weren't just soldiers, they were protectors. Protectors of the king, of the kingdom, and of the people who lived within its walls. One afternoon, after a particularly intense training session, Simon was asked to join Commander Eldrick on a patrol of the royal grounds. The two of them walked in silence, with Eldrick taking the lead, his eyes constantly scanning the area, always alert to any sign of danger. It was a skill Simon had seen the other guards master, this constant vigilance, this quiet awareness of everything happening around them. It was a reminder that the guards' job was never truly done. Even when they weren't fighting, they were always prepared, always on guard. "Do you see it yet?" Eldrick asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Simon had been walking beside him, focused on his surroundings. But the question caught him off guard. "See what?" Eldrick didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured for Simon to stop. The commander's gaze swept over the area past the palace walls. Beyond the trees, toward the horizon. Simon followed his gaze, but he couldn't see anything unusual. Eldrick sighed and turned to Simon. "You are learning the right things, but you are still too focused on the surface. You have to look deeper. A guard doesn't just observe what is in front of him, he feels the pulse of the kingdom. He knows when something is wrong before it happens." Simon blinked, trying to understand. "You mean it's about more than just seeing things with your eyes?" "Exactly," Eldrick said with a small nod. "It's about understanding the rhythm of the world around you. You begin to recognize patterns, the movement of the people, the sounds in the air, even the way the wind shifts. All of these things can tell you what's happening, even if you don't see it right away." Simon was quiet for a moment, thinking deeply about Eldrick's words. He realized that being a guard wasn't just about physical strength or skill with a sword. It was about awareness, being in tune with the world around you, anticipating problems before they arose, and acting with speed and precision when needed. As they continued their patrol, Simon's mind was racing. He began to see the kingdom in a new light. Not as a place filled with bustling markets and crowded streets, but as a living, breathing entity. One that required constant care and attention. The guards, Simon now understood, were the kingdom's first line of defense, its steady pulse. Without them, chaos could easily creep in. That night, as Simon lay in his bunk, the events of the day replayed in his mind. He thought about the guards he had come to know, Joran, the quiet one who had shared his thoughts on duty. Rolf, the older guard who had taught him the proper way to clean his armor. And Eldrick, the stoic leader who never seemed to show weakness. These men weren't just colleagues. They had become something of a family to Simon. He realized that he had learned more than just how to hold a sword or perform drills. He had learned what it meant to serve with honor, to put the needs of others before his own, and to be a part of something far bigger than himself. The next morning, after the usual training session, Eldrick called Simon aside. The commander looked at him with his piercing eyes, and for a moment, Simon felt the weight of his gaze. He stood at attention, waiting for Eldrick to speak. "You've come a long way, Simon," Eldrick said, his voice steady. "I've watched you grow from a man who could barely hold a sword into someone who understands what it means to be a guard. Your respect for the work we do, the discipline you've shown, it hasn't gone unnoticed." Simon felt a swell of pride at Eldrick's words. He had worked hard, and to hear the commander acknowledge his progress meant more than he could put into words. But even as he felt proud, he knew the road ahead wasn't over. He still had much to learn. Eldrick continued, his tone changing slightly. "You've earned a place among us. But there is still one thing I want you to understand. Respect isn't just earned, it's maintained. A guard's duty doesn't end with a single act of bravery or respect. It's a lifetime commitment. And every day, you must prove that you are worthy of the trust the king has placed in you." Simon nodded, understanding the weight of Eldrick's words. He wasn't just training to be a guard. He was training to be a part of something that would define the rest of his life. The lessons he had learned, the respect he had gained, weren't just for the moment, they were for the future. And that future would demand more from him, just as it demanded more from the guards who had come before him. "You are no longer just a merchant, Simon," Eldrick said, his voice softer now. "You are one of us, and I believe you will carry that honor with you for the rest of your life." The words hit Simon deeply. He had started this journey as a man full of pride, thinking he could rise above everyone else. But now, he was a part of something that was far greater than his own ambitions. The King's Guard was not just a group of soldiers, it was a brotherhood, bound by loyalty, discipline, and service to something much larger than any one person. As the days continued to pass, Simon embraced his new role. He worked harder, trained longer, and paid even closer attention to the details of his duties. And as time went on, the guards began to trust him more, treating him as one of their own. They no longer saw him as the arrogant merchant who had mocked them. They saw him as someone who had earned their respect. One afternoon, several weeks later, Simon stood at the gates of the palace with the rest of the guards. His armor gleamed in the sunlight, his posture straight and proud. He had come a long way since his first day in the barracks, and as he looked out over the kingdom he had once taken for granted, he felt a deep sense of pride. He had learned the value of respect, the importance of loyalty, and the strength that came from being part of something bigger than himself. Simon knew that he was no longer just a man with ambition. He was a protector of the kingdom, a member of the king's elite guard. And with that realization, he understood that the journey was far from over. There would always be more to learn, more to prove. But for the first time, Simon felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead.